From that, the whereabouts of two South Sudanese nationals allied to former Vice President-Riek Machar remain unclear, despite last week's High Court order to Kenya's Director of Immigration not to deport the two foreigners. Justice Luka Kimaru on Friday issued the directive after lawyers representing the families of Samuel Dong Luak and Agri Idri Esbon filed a suit to compel the state to explain the whereabouts of the South Sudanese nationals who have been living in Kenya as refugees. Justice Kimaru directed the County Criminal Investigations Officer Nicholas Kamwende to take over the case and investigate the alleged disappearance, as well as present a report in court on Tuesday. The judge further directed that a senior security official working for the government of South Sudan in Kenya be investigated on whether he has any connection to the disappearance. The families had complained that the official called them seeking to know the details of an affidavit filed in the case, though it had not been taken to court. Justice Kimaru also directed the mobile phone service providers to provide data on the missing persons communication. All right, and lawyer Eddie Orinda is with us in studio to discuss more on the missing South Sudanese detainees in the country. Many thanks for joining us in studio,
Thank
Eddie.
you for having me, Michelle.
Right, now when we spoke last week, the human rights groups as well as lawyers were appealing to the Kenyan government to reveal the whereabouts of Samuel and Agri, but a week later, has there been any word from the Kenyan security forces?
We've made very little progress. In fact, the purpose of the mention yesterday was to confirm how much progress the police have made in establishing the whereabouts of the two missing persons. In Justice Kimaru's orders, there were very specific directions indicating that Mr. Kamwende is supposed to report back to court with telephone records detailing the last persons they communicated with, and even more importantly, investigating the whereabouts of one alleged foreign intelligence operative from South Sudan on Kenyan soil, whom has been suspected by the families to have had something to do with the disappearance of the missing persons.
Why is that?
Unfortunately, there was no single word on this alleged operative. We were given further directions by court that we should return back on the 2nd, and they have now been given 2 days to establish those whereabouts and report back to court. We have also been asked by court to assist the police with any information that may be at our disposal, and in fact we've already made those steps. We had an initial meeting yesterday, whose details I'm not at liberty to disclose because it's already a subject of investigation, but it's basically focused on assisting the state find out where these two missing persons are.
And of course, you know, even as you assist the state, aren't you accusing the state of detaining these two officials?
On record, Michelle, before the court yesterday, indicating that to the extent of finding out where these two missing persons are, we are on the same side with the state. So any information that we can provide that they would find useful in getting those leads is something that I think we have to cooperate on. And that only makes sense because it's in the best interest of the state and of the families to share any information that could lead to finding these two missing persons.
Right.
So to that extent, we are on the same side. But of course, it's very clear that the families have expressed a lot of concern, and their fears, I think, are now being confirmed based on the story that you might have read on the first page of the Nation newspaper today, with a very clear picture of the Kasha brothers arriving at a U.S. airport. From a private jet, having been in Nairobi, despite of a court order stopping their extradition, and now they're facing different charges and trial in the U.S. That puts the families in a very awkward position and in fact reduces their confidence in terms of how much commitment the government really has in making
right.
sure that this is concluded.
And just paint us a picture of the concern and the fear that these families have with regard to their kin, and why it's so important that these two are not deported back to South Sudan.
I'm on record having indicated, both in the previous interview that I had here and even before Justice Kimaru, that these are very vocal critics of South Sudanese government. They have done that on social media and in many other forums. It is clear that they have received threats from the South Sudanese government. It is also clear that this alleged operative on behalf of the South Sudanese government has issued them with several warnings, asking them to stop being vocal on social media. It therefore then follows that if you take them back to such a country, it is highly likely that they'll be exposed to incommunicado detention arbitrarily. They're likely to be tortured. They're also likely to face a possible execution, being very vocal critics of the government. So those fears are founded on facts. And they're also founded on practices that we've seen in the past, beginning with Gadet's unlawful
detention
return,
as well.
back to South Sudan, where he now faces arbitrary detention in a solitary cell under very, very poor conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, the issue of James Gadet being deported back to South Sudan last year, the issue of these two missing South Sudanese nationals were yet to, their whereabouts yet to be identified, and then the case of the Akasha brothers that you just brought up. What does that say about Kenya's immigration policy?
I think it's a lot broader than Kenya's immigration policy, but this is how I want to put it. That if it is assumed that all these details are accurate, and if it is assumed that there could be rogue elements within government who effect these requests from foreign governments, then the president, as the person in charge of foreign policy direction, at this point has to direct the relevant ministries and immigration to issue a statement, because this is a clear foreign policy issue that is going to cause a lot of diplomatic tension, not only between Kenya and South Sudan, but even among countries that uphold international values and laws that protect refugees. And it's been very clear in the last few weeks since this happened that this is not acceptable to them, and that they're most likely going to react to this based on what direction this case is going to take when we return to court on the 2nd. But even more importantly, in the case of the Akashas, we have perceived the United States of America largely as an example of democracy. And one of the cornerstones of democracy in America is respect for the rule of law and constitutional values. I think I would be very keen to hear a statement from the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi regarding this deportation, and that will not be in conflict with the very values that they expose.
All right. All right. That's very interesting. And of course, as we wind up, you headed back to court on Tuesday for the report that was directed by Justice Kimaru. What expectations do you have?
One of our expectations remains standard, that these two persons will be produced in court. In fact, the application that we filed in court is still active. It has not been heard substantively, and in fact, the court accepted and directed that should there be any compelling reasons why we would want to be back in court even before the 2nd, that we can do that under certificate of agency. And therefore, we are still hoping to be heard substantively on that application, and that without preempting the meetings that we're already having with state officials regarding these investigations, that there's going to be good faith throughout this process, and that the safety of these two missing persons can be guaranteed, and that an assurance can be given to the families and the community of the South Sudanese who enjoy refugee status in Kenya, that they'll be protected by the government. One of the greatest fears now is that any one of them could be collected at any time bundled into a private jet and flown back to South Sudan.
Like happened with the Akashas. All right. Many thanks for speaking to us. That is lawyer Eddie Orinda here calling for the release of 2 South Sudanese detainees who worked with the former South Sudanese Vice President-Riek Machar. The 2 have been missing for the past 1.5 weeks, and human rights officials now calling for the Kenyan government to release them and, of course, assure their safety in the country.